Today we're going to be discussing the Spanish conquest of Latin America. Our focus is going to be on Cortez's conquest of the Central American city of Tenochtitlan that we discussed a little bit last week. And we're going to kind of focus on the sacking of Tenochtitlan. And of course, this all goes along with this week's film, The Other Conquest, which depicts Spanish conquest from the perspective of the Aztec people. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Following Columbus's first voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, he made 3 more journeys to the Western Hemisphere in his attempts to locate Japan, China, and India. Right up to the point of his death in 1506, Columbus continued to argue that he had sailed to Asia, a claim that other explorers in the employ of Spain and Portugal were beginning to deny. By 1504, the same year that Queen Isabella of Castile died, explorer, writer, and mapmaker Amerigo Vespucci argued that it was not Asia at all, but in fact a new continent, a new world. Based on the writings of Vespucci and others, a German cartographer labeled the new landmass America in 1507 on a world map. The notion that a new world lay just over the western horizon, filled with strange new plants, animals, foods, peoples, and wealth, was exceptionally enticing to the Spaniards. The New World was looked at as a place for new beginnings without the social hindrances of Europe. Clergymen such as Bartholomew de las Casas saw the New World as a land ripe for proselytizing, a continent filled with vast groups of people in need of the gospel of Jesus Christ. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, they were overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of native cities such as Tenochtitlan. Indeed, the sheer population of Tenochtitlan alone shocked Cortez and his soldiers. When the Spanish arrived at Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire was inhabited by around 1.5 million people. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time. There are amazing descriptions of the grandeur of this Aztec city by the arriving Spaniards, describing the cleanliness and the order of the streets, gardens, and the stunning variety and size of the marketplaces. It's said that the marketplaces of Tenochtitlan rivaled the marketplaces of Venice in Italy. The Valley of Mexico, where present-day Mexico City is situated, was the heart of the Aztec Empire. The Spanish built Mexico City literally on top of the Aztec capital. Now, this chart gives you an idea of the population density in Central and South America versus northern Mexico. When Europeans first came into contact with the Americas around 1500, it is estimated that the population of the American continents was between 75 and 100 million people. However, our best guess estimate puts it at around 75 to 80 million. The Spanish initially focused their attention on central Mexico for 3 basic reasons. Number 1, they needed to subdue the large, dense Indian populations. At the time, there were widespread Indian rebellions, and if European colonial rule was to prevail, they had to establish stability. Number 2, the Spanish wanted to use the indigenous labor system in order to gain access to and control indigenous labor and the things that they make and the stuff that they mine, particularly silver and gold. And then number 3, many Europeans saw it as their mission to Christianize the Indians, or to at least convert the indigenous population to believe in the European God. And in this photograph on your left, you can see a depiction from the Florentine Codex of several native women being converted to Catholicism by Spanish missionaries. Now, often when the people and cultures of the Old World encountered and interacted with those of the New World, conflict was a frequent outcome. However, because of certain advantages, Spanish conquistadors managed to subdue countless numbers of Indians, while untold hundreds of thousands died from disease, warfare, and poverty. So, if the Aztec Empire spanned much of central Mexico and had millions of inhabitants, how did 500 or so Spaniards come to dominate? That's a big task to conquer, subdue, employ, and convert over 7 million Indians, and the Spanish military agenda was significantly aided by other cultural, technological, and biological factors. Now, seven of these key factors that led to Spanish success in their conquest of native people include number one, their superior technology, namely in regard to their use of metal and gunpowder, which enabled them to make steel cannons, guns, steel armor, and steel swords. Number two, the Spanish use of horses and huge dogs also intimidated the Indians. While horses were native to the New World, the species had largely died out until Europeans reintroduced them in the continent in around the year 1500. At first sight, the Indians thought the horse and the man were one unified beast, so the sight was quite overwhelming for them. Also, the vital role of thousands of non Aztec Indian allies cannot be overstated. Since the Aztecs exacted huge tribute demands on the subjugated tribes around them, many were more than willing to join with Spanish to overthrow their Aztec enemies. Number four, insider knowledge of the Aztec Empire and the indigenous languages immensely helped Spanish conquerors. Certain individuals like La Malinche were very important in enabling Cortes to communicate with the indigenous tribes in their own languages. Cortes was thus able to learn a lot about the Aztecs, their beliefs, their tendencies, and political fissures, and he used this knowledge to his advantage. Number five were the different views of war held by the Spanish and the indigenous people. And thus, this prompted different war strategies. As we discussed last week, the Aztecs aimed to take live captives in order to sacrifice them to their gods, while the Spanish engaged in mass battlefield killings, often at a significant distance due to their firearms. Number six is disease, and it can't be overstated. It is estimated that approximately 75 to 99% of the indigenous population of the Americas were killed off by 1650. Although the brutality of conquest, the enslavement, and excessive labor demands on Indians contributed to some of the deaths, the overwhelming majority were caused by invisible microbes and viruses, which were really the colonizers' most potent weapon. From 1492 to 1650, the population went into a free fall, and then in the middle of the 17th century, the native population began to gradually recover. 1650 marks the bottoming out point, from around 100 million people to only about 5 million remaining. This is widely called the demographic collapse in colonial Latin America, and it refers to the dramatic decline in the indigenous population of the continents in the early century and a half after the arrival of Europeans. And then finally, the seventh key factor to Spanish success in their conquest of native people was the demoralization of indigenous peoples and their fatalistic worldview. As a consequence of the demographic collapse, there was a tremendous demoralization of the indigenous people, which probably led to a decline in their resistance to the Spanish. Indians were frustrated and deeply impressed by the Spaniards' resistance to these diseases. Clearly, the Spanish gods were more powerful than the Aztecs' gods in their eyes. The effect of disease also accentuated the indigenous fatalistic outlook on life. They felt as if their gods had abandoned them. And perhaps these gods of the Spaniards were truly stronger since so few Spanish had successfully conquered their large cities. In contrast to the indigenous, the Spanish had an arrogant and very optimistic outlook. The Spanish exploited the doubt among the indigenous in their own gods, which worked to their advantage. This is depicted in this week's film when the priest repeatedly tells Indians that their beliefs are nothing more than a pile of rocks. Now, the conquest of Latin America took place throughout the 16th century and even into the 17th century in some locations such as the Maya Highlands. The term conquest is problematic because the overthrow of Latin America involved much more than just the military subjugation of the various Indian populations in the Americas. In addition to the military strength, the conquest also involved a religious transformation as Indian beliefs were supplanted by Roman Catholicism. Indian social networks were disrupted by the Spanish caste system, and Indian economic and agricultural practices were transformed by Spain's desire for silver and gold. From the European perspective, the conquest and colonialization of the New World was about three things: God, glory, and gold. God was the missionary agenda of the Spanish to Christianize the indigenous souls, and this was, of course, linked to the power of the Catholic Church at the time. Glory, the Spanish were seeking personal glory. They were seeking heightened social status, fame, honor, and nobility. And then gold, acquiring wealth through conquest was really the main goal, both personally for the conquistadors and for the Spanish crown. Now, the subjugation of native peoples at the hands of the Spanish would begin in a few specific locations, most notably at Tenochtitlan in central Mexico, where Cortez would topple the Aztec Empire really in a matter of months. Now, the Spanish invasion of central Mexico is very much the story of Hernan Cortez and his skills as both a military tactician and as a charismatic orator. But the story of Cortez begins years before his arrival on the eastern coast of central Mexico in 1519. Cortez sailed to the Caribbean islands in 1503 at the age of 18. As a second son, Cortez was not entitled to wealth in the Spanish aristocracy, and his search for gold and adventure brought him to the New World, as it did many conquistadors. After his arrival in the New World, he soon began to make a living for himself in the colony of San Domingo on the island of Hispaniola. This is modern-day Cuba. Between 1511 and 1518, Cortez participated in a few conquests and discovery expeditions in the Caribbean, and by 1518 he was granted permission to lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland. He was granted this opportunity by Cuban governor Diego Velázquez, a famous conquistador and explorer who had taken Cortez on some earlier voyages. But as Cortez prepared for the voyage to Mexico, Velázquez began to have second thoughts about Cortez's integrity and tried to have him removed from command of the expedition. When Cortez learned of the impending change of plans, he committed an act of treason by gathering up his men and supplies and sailing for Mexico before he could be stopped by Spanish authorities. Cortez first landed in Mexico on the Yucatan Peninsula, where he briefly interacted with groups of Maya Indians. Cortez stopped again briefly in the modern area of Tabasco, where he received a gift from the local Indians of several native women. One of these women was La Malinche, who became a very valuable asset to Cortez because she spoke both the local Maya dialect and also the language of the Aztec Empire, and thus was able to translate for Cortez into his interactions with Mexican Indians. La Malinche is featured prominently in this week's film alongside Cortez, so be on the lookout for her. During Cortez's travels to the Aztec Empire of Tenochtitlan, he encountered several different groups of Indians, most of whom were Aztec tributaries or allies. But a few groups, particularly the Tlaxcalans, were still enemies of the Aztecs and had resisted conquest for decades. Seeing the Spanish soldiers as potential powerful allies, the Tlaxcalans sided with Cortez against their Aztec enemies and contributed Indian warriors to Cortez's expedition. Early in November of 1519, Cortez and his army were greeted by the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II and allowed to enter the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. Montezuma was wary of Cortez because of his apparent association with his Aztec enemies, and also because of several fearful premonitions that the superstitious Montezuma had had over the previous months. But he nevertheless invited Cortez into the city. Motives for both men have been widely debated by historians. Why would Emperor Montezuma allow Cortez to enter the capital city if Cortez was a potential threat? And why would Cortez enter the capital city if it was, as he feared, a potential trap? Well, it seems that Cortez was sufficiently confident of his strength in terms of men, arms, and allies that he did not believe he could be defeated inside the city. For Montezuma's part, many have speculated that he may have believed that Cortez was in fact or in part of a reincarnation of the ancient Central American deity Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent god of the ancient civilizations of Mexico. Now, modern scholarship has cast greater light on Montezuma's state of mind, superstitions, and beliefs surrounding the advent of the Spanish in Mexico. And it seems that he was somewhat paralyzed by indecision regarding how exactly to interact with the Spaniards. In 1520, Cortez attempted to take control of the Aztec Empire by taking Emperor Montezuma hostage and issuing orders through him. During a tense standoff, Spanish soldiers massacred a large number of Aztec nobles who are participating in a religious festival. The Aztec accounts of this massacre are part of this week's reading from the Florentine Codex. Now, after the massacre in which Cortez was not physically present, tensions were extremely high and the Aztecs planned to ambush the Spaniards inside the city where their artillery and gunpowder, weapons, and horses were less of an advantage to the conquistadors. When Cortez had the captive Emperor Montezuma address the people of the city and attempt to quell the tension, the Aztecs responded with hostility. What the Spanish did not understand was that when they had captured Montezuma, his status as Emperor of the Aztec Empire had evaporated and he had been replaced. At this point in the narrative, Montezuma dies, but accounts of his death depend largely on the source. The Spanish accounts claim that Montezuma was hit in the head by stones that were hurled at him by his own people as he tried to address them, and that he died later from his wounds. Aztec accounts, on the other hand, argue that Cortez ordered Montezuma killed after realizing that he was of no worth to the Spanish in securing any further wealth or in accomplishing a peaceful retreat from the city. The Spanish then attempted to escape from the Aztec capital, and on June 30th, 1520, after dark had fallen, the Spanish made a run for it. They attempted to flee across the main causeway that linked the Aztec city with the mainland on the lake shore. As the Spanish ran from the city under the cover of darkness and rain, they were weighed down by artillery, weapons, horses, sacks of loot, and various gold objects that they had taken from the city. When the Aztecs discovered their attempted retreat, they attacked the fleeing Spanish soldiers along the causeways. This nighttime escape-turned-massacre became known as the Noche Triste, or Sad Night. Thousands of Indian warriors allied to the Spanish died that night, securing the escape of Spanish conquerors, and the Spanish themselves losses estimated as high as 400 or 500 men. Most of the treasures and loot that they attempted to carry out of the city ended up at the bottom of the lake. The Spanish soldiers and their allies escaped to a nearby native town to measure their losses and plan their next move. Now, between February and May 1521, Cortez and his soldiers built 13 small sailing vessels, or brigantines, that could be used on Lake Texcoco to lay siege on the Aztec city. These small vessels were then carried to the shores of the lake in pieces, constructed, and then sent towards the Aztec island city. The Spanish quickly captured the causeways and effectively prevented the city from obtaining food supplies from the mainland. The Spanish also cut off the water supply to the city by destroying the aqueducts that carried spring water to the island from the mainland. The Aztecs had also suffered a massive outbreak of smallpox since the initial attack. The smallpox epidemic had been so devastating that thousands of Aztecs had died. Those who had survived were often too weak to care for the sick and for themselves, and they were unable to continue food production, leading to more deaths. The disease had also afflicted many of the leaders of the Aztec Empire. Many high ranking priests and political leaders had taken ill and died, including Montezuma's replacement. Due to the smallpox epidemic, the Aztecs were unable to resist the Spanish as forcefully as they might have under better conditions. Now, the final battles of Tenochtitlan were fought in the late summer of 1521, and much of the island city was devastated in street to street fighting. Finally, after nearly 3 months of warfare and siege, the last Aztec emperor surrendered, and the Spanish took complete control of the Aztec capital. The conquest of the mighty Aztec Empire was over, and the Spanish colonialism in the New World had begun. Now, the encounter and conquests were just the first short phase of the much longer colonial period. However, the results of the conquest and how it was done had long-term effects. In this sense, the dynamics of conquest laid the foundation for the subsequent emergence of colonial society in the New World.